Well, hello. Welcome to another edition of Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday interviews. Today, my guest is the wonderful and one of my best friends in the literary world, Padma Venkatraman. And she's been so wonderful over the years to indulge me in coming and visiting my classes and talking to me at conferences. And I was so taken aback by how brilliant this new book is. And I, you can say that, but Born Behind Bars is a wonderful follow-up to The Bridge Home. And in some ways they're related texts because they're middle grades and because they deal with kids of a certain age. But I've got to tell you, I've been reading a lot of books over the last 15 years of young adult literature. And I can count the number of times that when I finished a book, I felt compelled to draft a letter to the author. And this was one of those times. I sat down and finishing and it was late at night. I'm sometimes a night reader. So it was about 1 o'clock in the morning and I finished the book and set it down beside me and then got up and walked over to the computer and wrote an email to Padma. This book is a gorgeous book. And I don't say that lightly because if you know Padma's material, all of her books are gorgeous. A Time to Dance is a wonderful, compelling book. Climbing the Stairs is another book that I think is wonderful. And you just can't run by her books without thinking, oh, here is somebody who's in touch with the feelings of people. Island's End, which is another book of hers that people don't talk about enough, I think is another one. So I don't say that lightly, that Born Behind Bars was a book that I just thought, oh, this is a way, and we all know that the world is fraught with trouble for children and for adults as well, right? But to capture this singular story in this moment was really tremendous. So tell us a little bit about how you come to this book. I know that you have some Easter eggs to The Bridge Home in here and some of that, and maybe we won't talk about those too much, but just tell people there's a connection, there's some things, but how did you come to write Born Behind Bars?
So quite a while, Steve, Steve and I have known each other for so long. So you know better than anyone that my books sort of, the germination period for my books is quite long. And with Born Behind Bars, I read, I want to say, on the net, this article that was based on a BBC interview. And it was about a man who was telling his story about how he had been born behind bars because his mother was pregnant when she was jailed. And she was in jail. She was still in jail for like years and years and years. And so when I read that article, I think something in me was just so drawn to this story. And I started to envision this person, this real person as a character, as a boy. And I started to see this image of this young boy sitting in a jail cell, looking out of the window, looking at this bright blue sky. And I just knew that this kid, his imagination was out there. He wanted to be out there. And the way that he could do that for him was with his voice and his song. And it just, would get out, reach out the bars. And I started to hear him sing. And I realized that he was singing music by Kabir, who is a saint who actually tried to bring Islam and Hinduism together. And so he really worked to try to sort of find common ground between Muslims and Hindus in a way. I mean, there's different people who say different things about him, blah, blah, blah. But, he was somebody who was also for social reform. He was really trying to change the system, really trying to bring about, a more equal society as well. And, I started to think like, how is this character? Why is he singing these songs? Who is he? And then he sort of, as all my characters do, kind of got inside my brain, inside my heart. And I always know I am writing a book when I'm dreaming not of the character, but as the character, when I'm dreaming so much that I wake up seeing a scene through, in this case, my character Kabir's eyes.
I keep, this is one of those books that I visualized a lot in my mind. I kept thinking, oh, this would be the visual storytelling. And my experience with world travel is pretty good in Europe, and I've been to China, but I haven't been to India. And so I know that I'm using snippets from TV and other things that are all wrong, but I would love to see this made into a movie that was set, where it's written, right? I think it would be so telling and informative to students who know about this great big country, right, India, but what do they really know about this great big country with over 1 billion people? And we talk about it. I think most kids, I know when I was teaching high school, kids think of it as only a poor country. And certainly this is a story of a poor kid, but with 1 billion people, I like to say, perhaps they're middle class. If it's only 20%, that's the size almost of the United States, right? If it's 250 million people that are in that upper echelon. So the fact that there's both poverty and wealth, and they contrast with each other, and that there are still people essentially in kind of debtor's prison, right? It reminded me of Dickens. I think, I don't know if you channeled any Victorianism when you were doing this, but, Dickens as a young child, was in debtor's prison with his father. And so I thought, you're doing some things with this book that if people want to get a snapshot of something that they don't know or understand, this is a really great starting point, right?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Dickens is someone that I remember still I remember his other books as well, but the one book that I kind of remember, so when you were speaking about visual storytelling, Great Expectations, when I read that first, scene of the way you were in the marsh, and there was this little boy and there's this convict, and I could almost see this camera, panning the whole scene. And I know that that's a book that I kind of read over and over among there's so many other books as well. But since you bring up Dickens, I think I think a lot of his work, he's somebody that I think did so much with his work in the sense that it went beyond his stories. He caused social change. In a way, he was a vector for social change in a good way.
Yeah.
From what I've read. And that to me is, every time somebody says something like what you say, I just think, I hope that his blessings are on me and yours as well. I would love to see this book made into a movie too.
Yeah, well, let's all of us, we have all these great influences in our life. We wish that we could tell somebody, yes, do this, right? And they would do it. But how would you, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because I've run into several books where people are showing adolescents doing remarkable things and surviving in remarkable ways. And I think that one of the points about that is people might say, well, that's not true. So how would you counter that? You and I both know adolescents enough that we know they're doing these things. So how do you counter that? No, that couldn't really happen today.
I think if you're talking about people as survivors, and let me know if I'm wrong, I think there are so many things that, for me, these kids are not statistics. These kids are not numbers that I grew up reading about in India. For me, these kids are very real, and they're all based on actual human beings. The Bridge Home certainly is based on friends that I had. And I had this very, I think, unusual circumstance. And I think it's kind of unusual even now when you look at, by and large, South Asian authors writing for young people in the United States. I think my life story has a lot to do with the books that I write. I was born into a very privileged, very wealthy family. And then when my parents divorced, suddenly I lost all of that. And suddenly I was in a very different situation. And I think to live through an experience like that. I mean, I have been very lucky in Indian terms. Certainly, I was not on the streets. I was not hungry the way that some of the kids in the bridge home are, and not homeless in the way that some of the kids in born behind bars are. But I think I have touched an experience, I have lived an experience that perhaps many other people may not have. And I think that finds its way into books. And I certainly had a very traumatic childhood. And so I think living through that as well makes me know what it is to be a survivor.
Mm-hmm. And then you certainly had experiences where you, like you say, kids from the bridge home or kids like the kids you knew, and you have experience with those. I think more of us would build better empathy if we almost would believe at face value. Yes, there are kids who find themselves immediately on the streets. There are kids, and we need to figure out. And I when I say we, I think it's a global issue. It's a global problem that rather than trying to sidestep these issues or ignore them, we need to acknowledge first that they're real, and then wonder if there's concrete things we can do, right? So, I mean, I think your book, if I were teaching this book, I would ask kids in groups to say, well, what social reforms or social problems might arise from thinking about this book, right? For example, what's the justice behind giving a person this kind of jail sentence for this kind of failing? What do we do with parents if they're the sole support of a child, right? If they're in jail, is that right? So laws, homelessness, education, and the availability for education, the marginalization of Romani communities throughout the world still today, right? So how do we do those things? So I think you touched on so many topics that are timely, and while located in India, it's not that these same issues aren't cascading throughout maybe every country in the world. And certainly in the United States, we have remnants of all of these things, right? So right. It's really, really timely for me, and in some ways terrifyingly so, as we watch refugees flee from Afghanistan, and we give a lot of lip service, and are we willing to open up and help people who really need our help? Or are we just creating another long-term, health hazard and care hazard and education hazard without dealing with those things? So it's that. So I don't expect your books to solve the problems of the world, right? But certainly they are really, really good windows and doors, if we borrow from Rubin Sims Bishop, to let people see things that they may not be personally experiencing themselves. But on the other hand, if you're here in Las Vegas, where we are, we have kids who have experienced some of this trauma that are in these schools. So it's sometimes they are seeing themselves as well as others in these books. So the book comes out. What's the official release date? Tell us the official release date.
The official release date is September the 7th. Yeah, and so it's on pre-order already.
A week away from the posting of this interview. And so everybody can run out and get it. And as long as you're on your favorite bookstore's website, whatever that may be, you ought to buy The Bridge Home. You ought to buy, Time to Dance. And if you don't know Padma, you should buy those things as well. Let me ask you, see if you can thread something, because when I read these books and your books and the books of other authors, I sometimes look for the thread, right? Are there themes that reappear? Are there things? How would you thread your books together? Because each one is pretty independent with a story, but is there some thread you see that goes through all of your books?
I think there are two threads for me. One thread that I see is just the characters that I'm attracted to, the characters I want to spend years understanding, the characters that I really want to befriend in my mind and know inside out are characters who survive a lot mentally. And, I think that to me is so important. A lot of times, another kernel, I think that, or another thing that is a thread through all of my books is there's a kernel of truth always. The seed is always planted in reality, in a real person, in a real story. And I think for me, the third thing that has always been important, and Steve, you know more than I do with, just your vastness of knowledge in the field. But I think with climbing the stairs, I started sort of very naturally, because it's something that's very important to me, writing about spirituality, right? So my husband's background is Christian. My background is from the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And so it's always been, spirituality has been important to me without I don't think it's the place of any author to propagate anything, whether it's an idea or anything else. But I do think it's the place of an author to ask, to help a reader ask questions or to think or, just, ponder a little bit. And for me, spirituality has been something that I think is always there in my work in some way or another.
Well,
in a natural way.
I think that's absolutely true. I think of your books, and you've talked about this before when you were at the summit at UNLV a couple of years ago. You talked about that, but I think that's really especially true. I think in large measure in Island's End, where people are perhaps losing an entire way of believing or a way of connecting to spirituality that becomes marginalized as contemporary culture tries to invade, right? And people want to, and that's one of the beautiful things about Born Behind Bars, is where you see grandparents, for example, trying to push to the side biases or preconceived notions that they may have held in the past, and they are overcome in some ways in this, and this isn't giving anything away, with the joy in finding that they have a grandson, that they didn't know about, right? That there were some things going on that were veiled from them. And I think that fighting through those traditions of, should we embrace this person because they're one religion or the other? And the conflict between the Muslim and the Hindu religions in this book plays out in very interesting ways, which I think is something that in America we're trying to figure out as well. I mean, even as with different Christian sects, we sometimes don't know how to get along with each other, let alone layering on top of that, people who come from other cultures, and the stereotypical knee-jerk reaction, well, they're Muslim, so that must mean XYZ, or they're Hindu and it must mean XYZ, rather than listening to people and saying, oh, you have a spiritual tradition. How does that play out in your life, right? What parts of that are important to you? What parts of that would you like to share with me, right? Rather than say, oh, you must believe X, or you must, because we don't know. I know enough about some other religions to be dangerous, right? I don't know enough to have a real opinion. I need to be more open to those kinds of suggestions. So I think you've done that beautifully in, I think in A Time to Dance. I think the very act of dancing becomes both a prayer and an act of grace, of spirituality for the characters. That's one of the ways I remember the book. And frankly, it's been a few years since I've been in it, but that's how I walk away with that character, right? So what do you want people to walk away with from your books? You've got these threads. I think you're exactly right, these things, but what would you wish for your readers?
I think to ask questions, like I said, and to come up with their own answers, and to realize that sometimes important questions don't have just one answer, right? An important question can have so many different answers. That's something that I really want my readers to do, And I think until now, all of my books have been based in India because I lived there until I was 19. And then when I was 19, I left and moved all alone. And so, you know, that's a big part of my life. I am an American immigrant who immigrated on my own when I was barely, I guess, you know, barely an adult, I want to say these days, the more gray hair that I get on my head. But I think that I started to see not just the differences between cultures, but also the similarities. And I think there are so many parallels. And sometimes I think a book that is set in an international setting can allow you to dig deeper into a question because you don't immediately take the polarized position. So, you know, with Born Behind Bars, there's a very serious questions about the justice system. And, you know, how do we do this? And I think it, hopefully, the fact that it is set in India for an American reader may allow them to say, what is the justice system? What are these parallels between someone, a woman who in India is in jail and has not even had a day in court, partly because she is so socioeconomically deprived. So because she's from a low caste and because she has absolutely no money. She is a person who has nobody, no wealth, and unfortunately also no social status in a stratified society. What are the parallels between that and what we may be doing in our country to be really, really racist? Because, you know, if you look at the number of exonerations, which is the number of innocent people who have been now released because their innocence has been proven, 50% of those are people who are Black. Yeah. You know, and to maybe go from Born Behind Bars to asking those questions and saying, how is this happening? Why is this happening? What can we do better? Is for me so important.
Yeah, I love that. I've heard the phrase, you know, think globally, act locally, right? So
Yeah.
if I think that's a really good mantra to remind my students when they're reading this semester some books with global settings, to think, okay, what does this, you may think that it's not connected to you, but what ways do these things have remnants, or not more than remnants, right? Out and out injustices in our own society, right? And how are we doing that? That's a really beautiful walk away, right? What can you do in your own world to capture that? So do you have hints about what's next from Padma? You say that your books take a long time, but this was pretty quick on the heels of The Bridge Home. So do you have anything else that you're working on or ideas that are flowing through your head? So can you give us a taste?
Yeah, so there are a lot of ideas that are flowing through my head and have also made it out onto paper. So, not paper really, actually, my computer, I should say, and sometimes on paper because I scribble. The thing that happens is that I usually work on a couple of different ideas together. So in parallel, in tandem. And that's partly why the Born Behind Bars came out so quickly after The Bridge Home. I think partly it was because, you know, we were sitting at home during the pandemic with nothing else to do. And so I could, you know, really focus and revise. And my editor, Nancy Paulson, is so brilliant with helping me edit and getting the messiness out of the first drafts. So I think that's important for me. I have, I will say this because I have so many different ideas. I'm not sure what's next. I do think that the threads we spoke about are always going to be there. The thread of sort of, you know, the other social problems. I feel like I want to stretch my wings out a little bit. I have an idea for a middle grade. I have an idea for a YA. I have an idea for some picture books, all of which are not just ideas floating around, but on paper. So send me your blessings, and then hopefully they will happen. And then there's also a book that I'm writing for adults. So there's all of these things.
Oh, that's really exciting. It's wonderful to have these conversations with authors and to see what's playing in your mind. But I for one, I'm really glad that you kind of found this middle grades arena, because I really, you know, and we haven't talked so much about The Bridge Home, but it deserved every accolade it was given, and probably deserves more than what it has. But the world is so full of, really fine books that it's hard to find them surface. But it really, I think, got quite a bit of play, and I think is doing pretty well in the world, and the people that know it just rave about it. I would also, did you have any input on your cover artists, because they're reminiscent of one another? Is it, I'm assuming it's the same cover artist, or?
It is the same. It is the same. Her name is Jen Bricking, and Nancy and I knew that it would be the same person, because when she did the Bridge Home, we kind of just knew she did such a fabulous job with the cover of the Bridge Home that she would definitely do the Born Behind Bars. And there are so many, they're kind of companion books in a sense, because of course, as you know, one character from the Bridge Home has an appearance in Born Behind Bars as an adult. So there are these connections, and we definitely wanted that to be a thread. More and more I have an input, but that said, it's not always like my vision on the, as in I don't provide notes to anyone. It's, Nancy has a brilliant eye for art, and so she's the one who usually finds the artist and makes sure that the covers.
I just think they're both gorgeous covers, and I love the the barbed wire and the sense of being broken out of captivity that comes on this one, and with the bird on the shoulder, and there's just little suggestions of the richness you're going to find in this book if you are, if you pick it up and read it. It's as everybody knows, I'm teaching a young adult lit class, and one of the categories, they all get to select a middle grades novel, and I give them I give them a lot of suggestions, but not absolute free reign, and they curate that for me in our library downstairs. And I quickly said, you've got to add these two books. We're teaching the Bridge Home in the class, but I had them add Born Behind Bars and another book that I'm going to highlight next week, Barefoot Dreams of Petra Luna by Alda Dobbs. And I thought both of these need to be on the list, right? These two new books that are just coming out, so that my students have the opportunity to choose them. And it's great because I don't read a ton of middle grade fiction unless it's recommended or I know the author, because I tend to read older young adults, realistic fiction. But when somebody recommends something and you read it and you go, oh, they're okay, let's talk about them. And I'm sure that you hear this from other scholars as well. We wish that a young adult lit class could not teach 25 books, but 100 books, right? You can't and my students say, how am I supposed to read all these? And I say, you can't read enough, to know all the books you need to know for your students. You just can't. So you need to trust other, sources, and you need to trust experts. And, I'm never going to be the expert in fantasy, so I have to trust my colleagues who are, right? And do that. But this, from the first time I read Climbing the Stairs, I knew that it was going to be one of my goals to promote your work. And I've been watching every time you come out with one. And it's wonderful to know you and to read your works and to have the opportunity to share your works. And I hope that this is another avenue for which people will say, that Padma, I'm going to get one of those books and read it. And I hope wherever they start, and right now I say start with Born Behind Bars if you want, but any starting place would be a welcome gift in the mind of a reader to read your books and do that. So it's been great to talk with you. We'll have, like I say, we'll promote this, and we'll be sharing your work in the future, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your support and your blessings. That really, really has meant so much to me. I can't tell you. And doing the Alan keynote whenever it was that year, that was just a highlight of my life. I just thank you for everything.
My pleasure.